Hello, and thank you for joining. I'm Bob Howell, Senior Advisor for Critical Operations, and this is Michael Susong, Senior Vice President of Managed Risk Services and Global Intelligence. Today we wanted to touch base on a couple of different topics. One is hotel security. The recent attack we saw in Nairobi, of course, raised some concerns from clients, and we wanted to touch a little bit on what that potentially means from an intel analysis standpoint and then from an operations standpoint. Mike, can you tell a little bit more about what we saw and what we experienced in Nairobi for our clients?
The most recent attack in Nairobi was an Al-Qaeda-inspired group attacked the Riverside complex. 5 or 6 of those attackers, 2 of which took hostages on the 7th floor after detonating grenades, small arms fire, and an explosive device. So as we see in many of these circumstances, the complexity of individuals who are either employees or guests at the hotels or the complex, it becomes rather chaotic, and so preparation beforehand and anticipation is very important. The siege took place over the night, and it was actually the next morning before the Kenyan government was able to secure the property and make everyone safe. This gives a good example of what we're seeing as a pattern over the last decade of an average between 2 and 15 hotel attacks around the world, and they do vary in scale from what we just described at Nairobi to sometimes it's criminal elements, radicalized groups, anarchists, and sometimes it's groups of protesters that were in a city area, and if you will, the crowds or the violence spilled over into a hotel area. So it's very important to be prepared for many scenarios, either if you're on business travel or other travel in the area.
Great, Mike. And just to clarify for our clients here, 2 to 15, that's a month, a year. How often are we seeing those kind of a hotel
Correct,
attacks?
2 to 15 a month. So it's actually quite a consistent trend around the world.
So these hotel attacks, of course, become a concern for our travelers from the traveler perspective, but also our risk managers. So we want to make sure that our travelers are aware of hotel risk mitigation measures they can take. So, for example, choosing a room between the 2nd and the 7th floor. A lot of the fire ladder trucks in other countries can't reach higher than that, so making sure that you're reachable. Counting the number of doors between yours and the fire exit, so if there's heavy smoke, you can still find the fire exit by counting the doors. Walking the fire exits to make sure they're free of debris. A lot of times the ladder wells are used as storage areas, and it can hamper exit. Knowing where the fire exit door exits from the building at. Is it on a safe side of the building or not? Your room should not be over the lobby area or, if possible, facing the main entrance, because this is where attacks usually are generated from. So situations like this that's important for our travelers to be aware of to help mitigate any exposure they might have in a hotel environment. From a risk manager's perspective, we got to be concerned here. The attack in Nairobi was admittedly Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab is one of the major organizations in Africa. Over the last 18 months to 2 years, they've really perfected this attack technique by using some type of improvised explosive device to breach perimeter security, followed up by an assault team that causes much death and destruction as they can. So we've been seeing that for the last 18 months to 2 years in Somalia. We've now saw a similar attack recently in Bamako, Mali. Now we've seen one in Nairobi as well. And so we can expect to see this type of attack, this type of modus operandi expand not only across Africa, but how long before we see other organizations across the world adopt the same methodology. So hotel selection is going to be critical. Vetting hotels, keeping in mind that while in most cases Western hotels tend to be a little bit safer, they also become a prime target. So looking to see what we're doing for hotel assignments is really important. If you've got a long-term stays or long-term projects, we should be rotating hotels so we're not in the same place all the time and setting that standard that we're always, the Americans or the Westerners are always at a particular hotel. So taking in those things into considerations is very important. The other thing with hotels, of course, is your meeting and event risk management, right? So if you're having major events or client events, your hotel selection is also critical there. What type of setback distance do they have? What's the on-site security posture look like? Your liaison and coordination with host nation to be able to provide appropriate support. What kind of support and how timely and how capable are local services to be able to provide support? So hotel selection becomes a very critical component in that environment as well. Another area that we wanted to talk about too was demonstrations. We've been seeing a lot of demonstrations around the world, Mike, and I know you've got a feel for what that potentially looks like from a global perspective for our clients.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. What we've seen of late is an interesting trend involving social media. The most recent example is in Paris with the Yellow Vest protest, and that's spawned similar protest in Belgium as well. What makes this protest and this scenario different, and which I think is a concern to our clients, is the use of social media is generating near spontaneous protest. It could be in an intersection, it could be at the bridges, as we've seen also occurred in London. And it's also, we're seeing a mix of groups, whereas maybe before there was a bit of telegraphing, the security forces could be prepared for an event in an area. But again, these protests are spawned on social media. Within a few minutes, people rally at a location. In this particular case, because of the name of the Yellow Vest, they pull a vest out of their vehicle. It's a spontaneous event. The security forces don't have the time to respond. And just as quickly when they dissipate, we've seen examples of groups then reforming blocks or kilometers away. And then once again, your business, your travelers, your clientele may then suddenly find themselves in the middle of another situation. It's a real change we've seen.
Definitely. And that becomes a concern too from not only the traveler's perspective about trying to avoid any protests or demonstrations that they're seeing, if at all possible. That's what they need to do. If by chance they're caught in an environment there, they need to try to seek indoor shelter in a safe area and then immediately communicate with their security hotline or their global intelligence organization to inform them where they're at and what's going on, and then remain in a safe location until the all clear is sounded or until assistance arrives to be able to provide safe transportation to a safe haven or out of harm's way. From a risk manager standpoint, we got to take a look at what the typical response is by host nation. If we're talking developed nations, we're talking France, for example, there we're seeing non-lethal technologies being used. But if we're talking some countries in Africa, for example, Zimbabwe, recent demonstrations there, host nation was using live rounds downrange. So there's a total difference in our concern for our travelers and employees, and then what kind of risk mitigation measures we want to implement with respect to protecting our people. So we got to keep that in mind, whether it's in France, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Asia, Philippines, wherever. We've got to keep that in mind from a risk management perspective. Another thing I wanted to touch on base quickly about, Mike, was Venezuela. So Venezuela's a mess right now. They're over 3,000% inflation, and there's a lot of exodus out of the country. There's been some concern about a lot of the Venezuelans coming to Colombia, and now they're impacting the local economy. And some Colombians are raising some concerns about that. We'll have to see how that plays out. But the issue right now with Venezuela is that this weekend there's going to be some other major demonstrations that are planned. We hope everything goes peaceful. But if and when there is a regime change in Venezuela, then we're going to see a lot of regional and Western companies looking to come in there quickly to be able to capitalize on business opportunities. And so there's going to be a lot of concern about how you do that, how well you're prepared to do that, and then how safe is it when you initially come into country and be able to support that. So we just want to keep that in mind as we're looking at the Venezuela situation.
You make some good points, Bob. And in regards to Venezuela, as we see the situation hopefully resolve itself peacefully, it's a good time to remind that we see the dynamics in these situations still can be unstable. There's possibly there'll be incidents where crowds or groups are still gathering. And again, you expose yourself to the quality and the tools of the security forces. If it's non-lethal, even when they use tear gas, good examples on other circumstances when tear gas then seeps into a building or a metro or a bus station, people who weren't part of the protest on occasion panic and find themselves in a situation where they need to remove themselves quickly and safely.
Yeah, good points, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. If you need any more information, please don't hesitate to reach out to your account service manager or your sales rep. We're always here to provide any assistance we might. Thank you very much.